Hello everyone. So in this lecture video, I will be talking about the endocrine system. Okay, the endocrine system, similar to the nervous system, is actually a control. In this case, the control system of your body. So before, the nervous system control a lot of body physiological processes, and this is the same for the endocrine system. Okay, the only difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system as control systems is the endocrine system takes longer to be activated, takes longer to respond. But the response of the endocrine system is also long lasting. Okay? The nervous system, on the other hand, the response of the nervous system is instantaneous. It's very, very immediate, but at the same time, the effects of the nervous system is quiet, short-lived. Okay, so main difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system as control systems: endocrine, slow acting, but long lasting. Okay, whereas the nervous system is the opposite, fast acting, but in this case short term. In this case, so four main functions: regulating development, growth, and metabolism. So in this case, we're talking about growth hormone. We're talking about the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. We're also talking about thyroid hormone, which takes part in metabolism, cortisol, which also takes part in metabolism. Okay, maintaining homeostasis of blood composition and volume. This one of the hormones which is secreted by, in this case, primarily by the kidneys, is actually the hormone erythropoietin, which in this case induces the production of red blood cells. Okay, so that is just one of them. The other thing is controlling digestive processes. The pancreas, all right, is also an endocrine organ, and it actually manufactures two main hormones, in this case, insulin and glucagon. All right, and obviously I already talked about reproductive activities here in terms of testosterone, estrogen, plus we're going to be talking about other hormones as well in the future. We already talked about these are the major endocrine glands, and just to give you an overview of the hormones produced, parathyroid glands produces parathyroid hormone, which we know for a fact that actually has a purpose for, in this case, calcium, in this case, bone, all right, bone-like homeostasis. The adrenal gland has two main regions that actually manufactures hormones: the adrenal cortex, which has a lot of hormones. So cortisol is a hormone manufactured in the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex. We also have, in this case, we also have aldosterone, which is responsible for salt balance. Okay, as well as in this case the sex hormones, again, estrogen and testosterone. In the adrenal medulla, interestingly, two main hormones are manufactured, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you recall from the previous lecture, epinephrine and norepinephrine are also neurotransmitters in the nervous system. Okay, the hypothalamus, we're going to be talking about hypothalamus later, and the pituitary gland. But the pineal gland manufactures melatonin, which is responsible for, in this case, circadian rhythms. So it controls the sleep and rest cycles, okay, sleep and wake cycles. Thyroid gland manufactures thyroid hormone. We're going to be talking about that soon again. The skin, we already talked about the skin before. Calcitriol, vitamin D is a hormone, okay, all right, so that's a very, very important thing as well. The heart actually manufactures a hormone which is responsible for fluid balance. It's called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. Liver has a bunch of other things here, what we're not going to be talking about. The stomach, okay, the pancreas again, insulin, glucagon. Small intestine, adipose connective tissue, interestingly, folks, actually manufactures two hormones, or actually in this case are controlled by two hormones, leptin and ghrelin, which actually has, in this case, actually serves a purpose in hunger and satiety. Okay, and obviously the gonads and the ovaries. The gonads, which is the testis in the male and the ovaries in the female. That's a very, very quick overview of a lot of the hormones here, but we are going to be focusing, I'm going to tell you which hormones to focus on in the next slides. But know that these are all, in this case, all endocrine glands. Now, why is this called the endocrine system? First of all, this is based upon the type of gland that's actually in the endocrine system. There are actually two main types of gland. There are exocrine glands and endocrine glands. We already covered a couple of exocrine glands. Sweat glands and sebaceous glands are actually exocrine glands. And the reason why they're called exocrine is because they secrete Okay, they secrete their contents outside of the bloodstream. So sweat is on the surface of your skin, obviously. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, secrete their substances, their hormones, directly into the bloodstream. So those are the two main differences between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So how do you trigger the release of hormones in this case? So, and again, endocrine stimulation, we're trying to release hormones here. Three main ways: hormonal stimulation. So in this case, you have one hormone stimulating the release of a different hormone. Humoral stimulation, folks. Humoral stimulation means to say that blood levels. So if calcium levels in the blood go down, then there is in this case, a corresponding increase in the release of parathyroid hormone. Okay. The other thing is nervous system stimulation, and that's primarily between the sympathetic nervous system and, in this case, the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla in this case, right? So when you're stressed, right? When you're stressed, epinephrine and norepinephrine induces the release of more epinephrine and norepinephrine in this case. So three different ways that you actually stimulate endocrine hormone release, right? Through other hormones, through blood levels of something, and through the nervous system. There are two main types of hormones. So in this case, we're going to go back to a little bit of chemistry. We have water-soluble hormones. Water-soluble is also the same as polar hormones, so it means they love water. Okay, and fat-soluble hormones, which are hydrophobic, meaning they hate water. Okay, so there's a lot of mechanisms that is shown on this image, but one of the things that you can see is water-soluble hormones is released into circulation, and as you can see, there are no modifications that actually is required for these hormones to travel in the bloodstream. Why is that? Well, they're water soluble, and obviously this environment is generally high in water. Okay. However, the problem is the plasma membrane or the cell membrane is nonpolar. So in this case, the water soluble hormone cannot cross the plasma membrane. So the way they do this, folks, is they actually bind to a receptor on the surface of the plasma membrane, and then there is a secondary signal, okay, that then goes into the nucleus and regulates the manufacture of genes. And when we're talking about genes, we're talking about the manufacture of proteins, okay? Here's the deal, folks. This technique in which something docks on the surface of the plasma membrane and a secondary signal is needed to induce an effect is called the second messenger system. Okay, so the analogy that you can use is it's kind of like someone knocking at your door. You open up the door and this person says, "Hey, can you please go get this from the kitchen," or something like that. So in this case, this person does not enter their house. They tell someone else in the house to do something else. So that is how water-soluble hormones actually work. Insulin is an example of a water-soluble hormone. Growth hormone is also a water-soluble hormone. Okay. On the other hand, fat-soluble hormones. Okay. So as you can see, something is modified here. So they have to be carried by transport proteins because, again, the blood is has high amounts of water, right? So, and fat stuff does not like water, so you have to transport them in a special way through transport proteins. But the good thing about fat-soluble hormones or non-polar hormones is they readily diffuse through the plasma membrane. So because of this, they readily diffuse through the plasma membrane, and what happens is they themselves can actually interact with agents in the nucleus and directly either inhibit or in this case accelerate the production of specific proteins. So hormones, basically the whole effect of hormones is the induction, right, or reduction of the creation of proteins. And the way they do this is by targeting genes in the nucleus. Secondary messenger, whereas the fat-soluble hormones directly enters the plasma membrane and directly enters the nucleus. Two main ways. Two different types of hormones. All right, everyone, brace yourself. This is going to be a very, very, very important slide here. So there is a relationship between, this is the hypothalamus, and this is the pituitary gland. And here, all the way up to, I should write something here, all the way up to here, okay, all of these folks are hormones, okay, that actually come from the anterior pituitary gland. By the way, all of these are hormones that's actually manufactured, okay, by the anterior, and in this case, that is actually secreted from the anterior pituitary gland, okay. These other two folks, antidiuretic hormone oxytocin, is actually not manufactured in the posterior pituitary. What it actually happens is there are some neurons in the hypothalamus that actually secretes those hormones, and they are stored, okay, or they are released directly into the posterior pituitary, okay. This guys, on the other hand, all of these hormones, on the other hand, are actually in this case secreted, okay, or in this case are manufactured and stored in the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, you guys can see all of these hormones here. Now, there are names specific for hormones that are actually manufactured in the hypothalamus. Those hormones, there are generally two types. You actually have releasing or inhibiting hormones. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So gonadotropins, FSH and LH, is actually, in this case, induced to be released through a hormone from the hypothalamus called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay? Growth hormone, on the other hand, is induced, the secretion of growth hormone is induced by another releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH and GnRH. So a key here is if you see releasing or inhibiting, those are secreted from the hypothalamus and in turn induces either the release or not of specific hormones. So GnRH induces the release of two gonadotropins called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And these hormones, in this case, stimulate the production of eggs in females and in this sperm in males, as well as secondary sexual characteristics. Now, there's a second classification of hormones called inhibiting hormones, and it just so happens that there's only two types of inhibiting hormones that comes from the hypothalamus. One of them is actually a growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which means to say instead of making growth hormone released, what happens, folks, is it actually inhibits the release of growth hormone, and also a prolactin inhibiting hormone. So only two main types of inhibiting hormone. Okay, so let's follow one of this. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. It stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to manufacture follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which in turn stimulates the testes and ovaries, which in this case affects secondary sexual characteristics and the creation of gametes. So we're talking about gametes, we're talking about, again, sperm or eggs. Okay? So what happens there's also this thing called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, which is manufactured again by the hypothalamus, and that in turn, folks, induces the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. What happens then, it stimulates the adrenal cortex, okay? And the adrenal cortex, I kind of mentioned a few hormones before, that induces the release of aldosterone. Cortisol is actually one of the main hormones, okay? So those are actually how that whole cycle happens. Now, there's a negative feedback loop that happens here. So how do you turn off growth hormone? And I'm very, very sure about this thing. How do you turn off growth hormone? Once the levels of growth hormone in the blood is increased, there's a negative feedback loop that basically talks to multiple levels. And what happens is if you have high levels of growth hormone in the blood, that in turn shuts off the release of growth hormone releasing hormone. And guess what's manufactured at that point? You actually have growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay? So main